There was a war that never made the evening news. No front lines, no maps with arrows, no victory parades. And for the men who fought it, no official acknowledgement for decades that it ever happened at all. They were sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines in the 1960s and early 70s. Active duty U.S. military personnel doing exactly what they were told to do, where they were told to do it. They stood watch, turned valves, manned radar consoles, cleaned decks, sealed hatches, and followed orders without question. What they did not know was that they were also being deliberately exposed to chemical and biological agents as part of a classified Pentagon program, later known as Project 112, and its naval offshoot Project Shad. There were no consent forms, no briefings that told them what was actually happening, no warnings about long-term health risks. In many cases, they were told nothing at all. In others, they were told the substances released around them were harmless simulants, designed to test equipment, not people. That was not true, and in some cases, the people running the tests knew it was not true at the time. For decades, these men carried the consequences alone. The Cold War produced no shortage of terrifying weapons. Nuclear annihilation dominated public fear, but behind closed doors, military planners were equally obsessed with something quieter and far less visible: chemical and biological warfare. The belief was simple and deeply ingrained. If the Soviets or the Chinese ever used chemical or biological weapons, U.S. forces had to be ready to fight, survive, and keep operating in contaminated environments. That belief became doctrine. Doctrine became policy, and policy eventually became live testing on human beings. Not prisoners, not volunteers, not enemy combatants, American servicemen. What makes Project 112 and Project Shad different from other dark chapters of Cold War history is not just what was tested, but how it was tested, and how thoroughly it was buried afterward. These were not isolated laboratory experiments or small-scale trials. They were large, coordinated tests conducted across deserts, jungles, Arctic environments, and open ocean. Entire ships' crews were used as test populations. Thousands of personnel were involved, most of them unaware that they were part of anything unusual at all. When the tests ended, the silence began. Service members rotated out, discharged, and returned to civilian life. Some became sick quickly, others noticed problems years or decades later: respiratory issues, neurological symptoms, chronic fatigue, autoimmune disorders, cancers that appeared way too early or in strange combinations. When they went to the Department of Veterans Affairs, they were told there was no record of exposure. When they compared notes with other veterans, they discovered the same symptoms appearing again and again among men who had served on the same ships or in the same units. Still, the government said nothing. Medical records were classified. Test names meant nothing without context. The very existence of the program was denied, then deflected, then buried under layers of national security language. For years, veterans were effectively told that what they experienced could not be proven, and therefore did not matter. If the war was secret, then so were the casualties. This was not an accident. It was a system working exactly as designed. Project 112 was born in an era when secrecy was considered synonymous with safety. Oversight was minimal, ethical boundaries were flexible. The Nuremberg Code, created after World War II to prevent human experimentation without consent, existed on paper, but it was quietly step-sided in practice. The men subjected to these tests were not labeled as experimental subjects. They were labeled as participants in training or defensive readiness evaluations. That semantic trick made all the difference. And for decades it worked. The story of Project 112 and Project Shad is not just about chemical agents or Cold War paranoia. It's about institutional power, moral shortcuts, and the assumption that certain people, especially those in uniform, could be exposed, sacrificed, and forgotten in the name of national security. It's about what happens when secrecy outlives necessity, and when acknowledgement arrives too late to undo the damage. This is the story of that hidden war, how it began, what was done, who paid the price, and why, even now, the full truth remains uncomfortable for the institutions that authorized it. To understand how a program like Project 112 could exist at all, you have to understand the Cold War not as history, but as a mindset. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, American military planners were not just worried about losing a war, they were worried about losing control of one. Nuclear weapons had rewritten every rule of strategy, but they also created a paradox. If nuclear war meant mutual annihilation, then the next major conflict would likely be fought in the shadows, below the nuclear threshold. That is where chemical and biological weapons lived. The fear was not abstract. Intelligence estimated warned that the Soviet Union manipulated extensive chemical warfare stockpiles. China was believed to be developing similar capabilities. Both were assuming to have fewer ethical constraints and a higher tolerance for mass casualties. Whether those assumptions were accurate mattered less than the fact that they were believed at the highest levels of the U.S. government. From the Pentagon's perspective, chemical and biological warfare was not a question of if, but when. The problem was readiness. Gas masks, protective suits, shipboard ventilation systems, decontamination procedures. All of it looked good on paper. None of it had been tested under realistic conditions. Laboratory experiments could measure toxicity. Wind tunnels could model dispersion. But war did not happen in controlled environments. War happened on ships with open hatches, in deserts with shifting winds, in jungles where humidity trapped aerosols, and in Arctic cold that changed how chemicals behaved. And so the logic took hold. If American forces were going to survive a chemical or biological attack, they had to train and test in conditions as close to real combat as possible. That logic quietly crossed a line. By the early 1960s, the U.S. Department of Defense, specifically the Department of Defense, was operating under a doctrine that treated exposure as an acceptable risk. The assumption was that service members might be exposed in wartime anyway, so exposing them during peacetime testing was not fundamentally different. In fact, it was framed as responsible preparation. Better to find weaknesses now than during a shooting war. What was missing from that calculation was consent. These were not volunteer test pilots pushing experimental aircraft to the edge. They were enlisted sailors and soldiers who had signed up to serve, not to become unwitting subjects in chemical warfare trials. But the culture of the time did not encourage questioning orders, especially when those orders were wrapped in national security language. The Cold War rewarded obedience, compartmentalization, and silence. Secrecy was not just a tool, it was a virtue. Programs were divided into pieces so that no one outside a small inner circle understood the full scope of what was happening. Officers knew test names, but not agents. Enlisted personnel knew procedures, but not purposes. Medical officers monitored effects without always being told what substances were involved. Each layer could plausibly claim ignorance, even as the machine as a whole moved forward. Ethics, when discussed at all, were treated as an obstacle to be managed rather than a boundary to be respected. The Nuremberg trials were less than 2 decades old, and the principles that emerged from them were well known. Human experimentation without informed consent had been explicitly condemned. But internally, these tests were not labeled as experiments. They were labeled as defensive evaluation, readiness trials, or vulnerability assessments. The words changed, the reality did not. The Cold War also created a powerful sense of urgency. Leaders believed they were racing time itself. Every delay increased the risk that the United States would be caught unprepared. That pressure encouraged shortcuts, rationalizations, and decisions that would have been harder to justify in calmer times. When everything is framed as existential, almost anything can be excused. By the time Project 112 was formally authorized, the groundwork had already been laid. The moral guardrails were loosened. The assumption that service members could be exposed for their own good had become normalized. The belief that secrecy outweighed transparency had hardened into doctrine. In that environment, Project 112 did not look radical. It looked necessary. And once necessity becomes the justification, the next step, testing on real people in real environments, stops being a question of whether it should happen and becomes a question of how fast can it be done. Project 112 did not appear suddenly, nor was it the work of a single rogue office buried somewhere in the Pentagon. It emerged the way many Cold War programs did, quietly, incrementally, and wrapped in language that made it sound defensive, reasonable, and unavoidable. In 1961, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara approved what was officially described as a comprehensive initiative to evaluate U.S. vulnerability to chemical and biological warfare. The stated goal was protection, detection, readiness, survivability. On paper, Project 112 existed to answer a simple question. If the United States were attacked with chemical or biological weapons, how well would its forces perform? The problem was how that question would be answered. Responsibility for executing the program fell largely to the U.S. Army, specifically through a little-known organization called the Deseret Test Center. Based in Utah, Deseret was chosen for reasons that made perfect bureaucratic sense. It was remote, it already supported Dugway Proving Ground, it had experience with classified testing, and most importantly, it was far from public scrutiny. What happened there could stay there. Project 112 was deliberately structured to avoid attention. It did not have a public-facing name. The number 112 meant nothing outside a narrow planning circle. Funding was buried inside larger research and development budgets. Tests were divided into dozens of individually named trials, each with its own objectives, locations, and participants. Even if someone stumbled across a single test, it would not reveal the existence of a broader program. Compartmentalization was the shield. From the start, Project 112 expanded far beyond controlled laboratory work. Army planners quickly concluded that static tests could not replicate real-world conditions. Chemical and biological agents behave differently depending on terrain, climate, and human activity. Wind mattered, heat mattered, moisture mattered, movement mattered. To understand vulnerability, they argued, you had to observe what happened when real people moved through contaminated spaces, operated equipment, and tried to function normally. That meant taking the tests out of the lab. Between 1962 and 1973, Project 112 tests were conducted in an astonishing range of environments. Deserts in Utah and Nevada, tropical locations in Panama and Hawaii, Arctic conditions in Alaska, and eventually the open ocean. Each environment was chosen to answer a specific question about dispersion, persistence, and exposure. How long did an aerosol remain airborne? How far did it travel? How easily did it enter vehicles, shelters, or ships? How quickly could troops be contaminated without realizing it? The answer, time and again, was very easily. Officially, Project 112 was supposed to focus on defensive readiness, how to detect an attack, how to protect forces, how to recover afterward. Unofficially, it became something else entirely. It became a live-fire exercise in chemical and biological exposure, with American service members standing in for hypothetical future casualties. The line between testing equipment and testing people blurred almost immediately. One of the most revealing aspects of Project 112 was who was not involved. There was no meaningful civilian oversight. Congress was not briefed in detail. Medical ethics boards were not consulted in any modern sense. Decisions were made internally, justified internally, and reviewed internally. The same institution that proposed the tests also evaluated their necessity and safety. This is not a recipe for restraint. Orders flowed downward, stripped of context as they went. Senior planners discussed agents and dispersal models. Mid-level officers discussed procedures and objectives. Enlisted personnel received instructions measured in minutes and meters. Stand here, move there, operate this equipment, report symptoms if you notice anything unusual. At no point were participants told what substances were involved or that exposure itself was the point of the exercise. In many cases, the tests were designed so that participants would not immediately realize anything had happened at all. That was intentional. If a chemical or biological attack occurred in wartime, there would be no warning label, no announcement, no courtesy knock. Project 112 aimed to replicate that surprise. What it did not replicate was choice. The service members involved were never given the option to opt out because officially there was nothing to opt out of. By the mid-1960s, Project 112 had grown into a sprawling multi-year effort touching every branch of the military. It had its own planning bureaucracy, its own test schedules, and its own internal language designed to keep outsiders from understanding what was happening. And still, very few people questioned whether it should continue. Because by then, the program had momentum. And once momentum takes hold inside a classified system, stopping it requires someone to ask a dangerous question. What if this is wrong? That question, for a long time, went unasked. By the mid-1960s, the planners behind Project 112 had run into a problem they could not solve on land: ships. The U.S. Navy was central to Cold War strategy. Carrier groups projected power, submarines carried nuclear weapons, and surface fleets moved troops and supplies across the globe. If chemical or biological weapons were used in a future war, naval forces would almost certainly be targeted. A ship at sea was both a perfect test platform and a worst-case scenario. Confined spaces, shared air, complex ventilation systems, and nowhere to evacuate. From the Pentagon's point of view, ships were not just vulnerable, they were laboratories waiting to be used. That logic gave birth to Project SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense, a subset of Project 112 focused entirely on naval testing. Officially, SHAD existed to evaluate shipboard detection systems, protective equipment, and decontamination procedures. Unofficially, it did something far more consequential. It exposed entire crews to chemical and biological agents to see what would happen. Unlike land-based tests, shipboard trials offered something planners considered invaluable: control. A ship could be isolated, its movements tracked, its airflows measured. Every sailor on board could be accounted for before, during, and after a test. If an agent was released, there was no risk of it drifting into civilian populations. The ocean was seen as a natural buffer, absorbing mistakes without witnesses. That assumption would later prove dangerously optimistic. SHAD tests were conducted on a range of vessels, from destroyers and amphibious ships to specially modified platforms designed specifically for testing. Crews were selected not because they volunteered, but because their ships were assigned. Orders came down through normal naval channels. There was nothing to those orders that suggested participation in an experiment. Sailors were told they were supporting readiness evaluations or equipment trials. For most, it sounded routine. What they were not told was that the trials involved live releases of chemical and biological agents, sometimes real, sometimes labeled as simulants, sometimes something in between. Shipboard life amplified exposure in ways land-based planners fully understood. Ventilation systems pulled air from outside and redistributed it throughout the ship. Compartments were sealed or opened according to operational needs, not medical ones. Sailors worked, ate, slept, and exercised in the same enclosed environment. If an agent entered the airflow, it did not just affect one space, it affected the ship. That was the point. SHAD tests were designed to answer questions that could not be answered any other way. How quickly would a chemical agent spread through a vessel? How effective were masks and protective gear during routine operations? Would sailors even notice exposure before symptoms appeared? How long would contamination persist on surfaces, clothing, and equipment? To answer those questions honestly, the tests had to feel real. That meant no advance warning, no evacuation, no interruption of normal shipboard routines. Crews were often told to continue their duties unless specifically instructed otherwise. In some cases, alarms were deliberately not sounded to see how long it took before personnel realized something was wrong. The ethical implications were staggering, but inside the program, they were framed as unavoidable. The assumption was that sailors might face the same conditions in wartime without choice or warning. Therefore, exposing them during peacetime was considered preparation, not experimentation. The distinction was bureaucratic, but it carried enormous consequences. As long as SHAD was defined as training or testing equipment, informed consent could always be bypassed entirely. And so it was. Medical personnel on board were often placed in an impossible position. They monitored crews for symptoms without being fully briefed on what substances were involved. Some were told agents were harmless. Others were told only what they needed to know to perform immediate evaluations. Long-term follow-up was rarely planned, and when it was, the data often disappeared into classified files. The Navy's culture of discipline and hierarchy played directly into the program's success. Sailors did not question orders. They trusted that what they were being asked to do had been approved at levels far above them, and in a sense it had. The problem was that approval did not equal accountability. By the late 1960s, Project SHAD was operating smoothly, quietly, and repeatedly. Dozens of tests were conducted across the Pacific and Atlantic. Crews rotated in and out. Exposure events came and went. Paperwork was filed. Lessons were learned, at least from the perspective of the planners. For the sailors involved, most of whom had no idea what they had been exposed to, the story would not begin to unravel for decades. And when they did, the Navy would discover that ships make excellent laboratories, but very poor places to hide the truth. From the outside, the most disturbing question about Project 112 and Project SHAD seems simple. What exactly were they exposed to? The internal answer was anything but simple. Officially, the Department of Defense maintained that most SHAD tests used simulants, substances chosen because they supposedly behaved like real chemical or biological agents without posing serious health risks. These simulants were said to mimic dispersion patterns, persistence, and penetration without harming personnel. For years, this claim was used as a shield against veteran complaints and congressional scrutiny. The problem was that the definition of harmless was flexible, sometimes dangerously so. Among the substances used were biological simulants like Bacillus globigii, later renamed Bacillus subtilis. At the time, it was widely described as non-pathogenic. It was sprayed into the air, released in aerosols, and dispersed throughout ventilation systems. Only later did researchers acknowledge that it could cause serious infections in immunocompromised individuals and respiratory issues in others. That knowledge existed in fragments even during the 1960s, but it was downplayed in the rush to continue testing. Chemical simulants were no better. Zinc cadmium sulfide was used in some tests to track particle movement. Cadmium, even then, was known to be toxic. The assumption was that small amounts were acceptable. Long-term exposure, cumulative effects, and individual susceptibility were not meaningfully considered. But simulants were only part of the story. In several Project 112 and SHAD tests, real chemical warfare agents were used. Nerve agents such as sarin and VX were released in controlled quantities to study detection systems and protective measures. In official language, these were described as limited, dilute, or non-lethal exposures. In reality, there was no safe exposure threshold for many nerve agents. The difference between non-lethal and harmless is enormous, and it was a difference rarely explained to those on the receiving end. What made the situation worse was inconsistency. Sailors and soldiers were not told what type of test they were participating in. A crew exposed to a simulant one week might be exposed to a live agent the next, with no meaningful distinction made in how the event was presented. Protective measures varied widely. In some tests, masks were worn. In others, they were deliberately not used to evaluate vulnerability. In still others, protective gear was worn incorrectly on purpose to see how much exposure occurred. From the perspective of the test designers, variability was a feature, not a flaw. War was unpredictable, therefore the test should be unpredictable too. For participants, unpredictability translated into risks they could neither see nor assess. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of these tests was not the substances themselves, but the misrepresentation surrounding them. Many service members were explicitly told that the materials released were harmless. Others were told nothing at all. In post-test briefings, when they occurred, the language was carefully chosen to avoid alarm. Terms like smoke, fog, or tracer particles were used instead of chemical names. Questions were discouraged. Documentation was minimal. This was not accidental. If personnel believed they had been exposed to dangerous substances, it could interfere with test results, create operational disruption, or generate paper trails that would later be hard to explain. Silence preserved control. The internal documents paint a different picture. Planning memos discuss toxicity levels, exposure limits, and risk trade-offs in technical detail. Warnings were acknowledged, then overridden. In several cases, test planners explicitly noted that personnel would be exposed, but justified it as acceptable within the mission scope. That information stayed at the top. Down below, sailors kept working. What makes this chapter especially difficult is that even now, there is no complete list of substances released during Project 112 and SHAD. Records were lost, destroyed, or remain classified. Veterans seeking answers often discover that the test they participated in is acknowledged only by name and date, with no substance listed. Others find partial disclosures that change over time as more documents are declassified. The result is a moving target. A veteran may be told one year that only simulants were used, then later informed that live agents were involved after all. Each correction comes decades too late to undo the damage. The language of simulants served its purpose. It reassured commanders, it deflected accountability, and it allowed the program to continue under the appearance of safety. But for the men who inhaled the particles, absorbed those chemicals, and carried them home in their bodies, the distinction between real agents and pretend ones meant very little. Exposure is exposure. And when the government finally admitted what had been released, many veterans were left with a bitter realization. The most dangerous substance they were exposed to was not a chemical at all. It was the lie that told them they had nothing to worry about. If Project SHAD had a symbol, one ship that embodied how far the program was willing to go, it was the USS Granville S. Hall. Originally built as a standard cargo vessel, the Granville S. Hall was transformed into something far more unusual. By the mid-1960s, she had been stripped of her conventional role and converted into a dedicated test platform. Antennas, sampling equipment, detection systems, and monitoring gear were installed throughout the ship. Compartments were modified to measure airflow. Sensors tracked particles invisible to the naked eye. What emerged was not a warship in the traditional sense, but a floating laboratory designed to expose itself and its crew to chemical and biological agents over and over again. From 1964 to 1969, the Granville S. Hall participated in a large number of SHAD tests, more than any other vessel. She operated primarily in the Pacific, often in remote waters where tests could be conducted without civilian observation. Her missions were repetitive by design: sail into a test area, maintain specific headings and speeds, operate ventilation systems according to test protocols, continue routine shipboard activities unless instructed otherwise, then move on to the next test. For the crew, it felt like an unusually busy but otherwise unremarkable assignment. Sailors were rotated in and out like any other duty station. Some stayed for a single deployment, others remained for years. Very few were told why their ship was consistently involved in special operations, and few still were told what substances were being released around them. What set the Granville S. Hall apart was not just the number of tests, but the intensity. Agents were released directly upwind of the ship to ensure maximum exposure. Ventilation systems were deliberately left running to pull aerosols inside. In some trials, sailors were ordered to remain below decks while substances were released topside, specifically to test how quickly contaminants infiltrated living and working spaces. This was exposure by design. Crew members later recalled strange fogs drifting across the deck, powdery residues settling on surfaces, occasional alarms followed by assurances that everything was safe. Some reported immediate symptoms, burning eyes, nausea, headaches, breathing difficulties, that were dismissed as temporary irritation. Others noticed nothing at the time, only to develop chronic health problems years later. What made the Granville S. Hall particularly significant was the cumulative nature of exposure. Unlike crews on ships that participated in 1 or 2 tests, sailors assigned to this vessel experienced repeated events. Week after week, month after month, each individual test might have been described as low level. Taken together, they formed a pattern of prolonged exposure that no one on board had agreed to and no one had been warned about. Medical oversight existed, but it was narrow and short term. Corpsmen and medical officers monitored acute symptoms. They treated what they could see. There was no system in place to track long-term effects after sailors transferred or left the service. Once a deployment ended, the data trail effectively stopped. Whatever happened later was no longer the Navy's problem. Years later, when veterans from the Granville S. Hall began comparing experiences, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Similar illnesses, similar timelines, similar frustration when dealing with the VA. Yet for decades, the Navy refused to acknowledge the ship's role. Even when Project Shad was partially declassified, details about individual vessels were slow to emerge. The irony is that the ship was never meant to be hidden forever. Internally, the Granville S. Hall was well documented. Test planners knew exactly what had been done aboard her. What they underestimated was time. As records aged and personnel retired, institutional memory faded. When veterans came looking for answers, they found a system that no longer wanted to remember. The Granville S. Hall proves that Project Shad was not a theoretical exercise or a marginal program. It was operational, sustained, and deeply ingrained into the Navy's Cold War posture. Entire crews were exposed not once, but repeatedly, in the name of readiness. And if one ship could be used this way, quietly, efficiently, and without consent, it raises a far more troubling question. How many others were floating laboratories too? By the time Project 112 and Project Shad were in full operation, the United States had already helped write the rules that said this should never happen. After World War II, the Nuremberg trials exposed the horrors of human experimentation carried out in the name of science and national survival. One of the outcomes was the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles intended to prevent future abuses. Its first and most important rule was unmistakable. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. That principle was not obscure. It was taught in military medical circles. It was cited in policy discussions. It was part of the moral foundation the United States claimed to stand on during the Cold War. And yet, Project 112 and Project Shad were built specifically to avoid it. The workaround was linguistic and bureaucratic. These were not experiments. They were not medical tests. They were defensive evaluations, readiness exercises, and equipment trials. The subjects were not test participants. They were service members carrying out assigned duties. As long as the program could maintain that framing, informed consent was not required, at least on paper. In practice, the distinction was meaningless. The entire purpose of many Shad tests was to observe how human beings responded to exposure. Detection systems could be evaluated without people. Filters could be tested without crews. But understanding how contamination spread through a ship, how quickly sailors noticed symptoms, and how performance degraded under exposure required human beings doing normal work in contaminated environments. That made them subjects, whether the paperwork admitted it or not. Consent was not merely absent, it was actively prevented. Service members were not given enough information to object, even if they wanted to. Many were never told anything unusual was occurring. Others were told the substances involved were harmless, which removes the basis for refusal. Even officers who suspected something was off often lacked enough detail to challenge orders meaningfully. And challenging orders carried consequences. The military of the 1960s was not a culture that encouraged dissent, especially in classified programs. Questioning orders could derail a career. Refusals could result in disciplinary action. In some cases, personnel were reminded that participation was mandatory because it was part of their assigned mission. The chain of command closed ranks around the program. Medical ethics were bent to fit operational needs. Physicians and corpsmen were embedded in tests to monitor acute effects, not to advocate for the long-term welfare of participants. They treated immediate symptoms, recorded data, and moved on. Follow-up care was rare, disclosure was limited, the doctor-patient relationship was subordinated to the mission. What makes this especially troubling is that the risks were not unknown. Internal documents acknowledged potential harm, exposure limits were debated, trade-offs were calculated. Decisions were made that certain levels of risk were acceptable in pursuit of readiness. Those decisions were made without the knowledge or consent of the people bearing the risk. That is the core ethical failure. The argument offered decades later that exposure might have happened in wartime anyway does not withstand scrutiny. In war, exposure is imposed by an enemy. In Project Shad, exposure was imposed by one's own government during peacetime. That difference matters. One is a hazard of combat, the other is a choice made by leadership. For the veterans involved, the lack of consent became a second injury layered on top of the first. Not only were they exposed, but they were denied the dignity of knowing what had been done to them. When health problems emerged years later, they had no documentation to point to, no warnings to reference, and no acknowledgement that their experience fit a known pattern. They were left to prove the unprovable. Project 112 and Project Shad demonstrate how easily ethical safeguards can be bypassed when secrecy, urgency, and institutional power align. The rules existed, the lessons of history were known, but compliance would have slowed the program, created resistance, and raised uncomfortable questions. So the rules were quietly ignored, and the men who paid the price were never given the chance to say yes or no. When the test ended, there was no debriefing that mattered. Service members rotated off ships, left test sites, and transferred to new duty stations just as they always had. There were no exit interviews explaining what they had been exposed to, no long-term medical monitoring programs, no warnings to watch for delayed symptoms. As far as the official record was concerned, Project 112 and Project Shad ended cleanly, like any other Cold War readiness initiative. For the people involved, the effects were anything but clean. Some veterans noticed problems almost immediately. Persistent coughs, skin issues, headaches that never quite went away. Others carried on for years before something changed. Fatigue that did not respond to rest, memory issues, unexplained neurological symptoms, autoimmune disorders, cancers appearing earlier than expected. Individually, none of these conditions raised alarms. Collectively, they formed a pattern no one seemed willing to see. When veterans sought help, they ran headlong into silence. Medical records from test periods were often incomplete or missing entirely. Exposure events were not documented in individual service files. Test names, when they appeared at all, were meaningless without context. A veteran could point to a deployment, a ship, even a specific date, and still be told there was no evidence of hazardous exposure. That answer came back again and again, especially from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The VA operates on documentation. To receive service-connected disability benefits, a veteran must show three things: a current medical condition, an in-service event or exposure, and a nexus linking the two. Project Shad veterans often had the first. They struggled to prove the second. Without acknowledgement of exposure, the third was nearly impossible. This was not a coincidence. It was structural. Project 112 was classified at the highest levels for decades. Even as classification slowly loosened, disclosures were partial and fragmented. Some tests were acknowledged, others were not. Lists of participating ships and units changed over time. Veterans who had previously been told their ship was not involved were later informed that it was. The goalposts moved, sometimes years apart. In the meantime, records vanished. Some were destroyed under routine document retention policies. Others were misplaced as offices reorganized and commands dissolved. Still others remained classified long after the rationale for secrecy had expired. Each missing file made it easier to deny claims and harder for veterans to prove their cases. Silence was reinforced by non-disclosure agreements and security oaths. Many participants suspected that something was wrong, but believed that they were legally prohibited from discussing it. Others tried to speak up and were dismissed, told they were mistaken, or reassured that nothing dangerous had occurred. The system rewarded quiet endurance and punished persistence. For years, veterans compared notes only in small circles, ship reunions, informal gatherings, quiet conversations that always ended the same way. You too? Symptoms overlapped, timelines matched, frustration grew. Still, without official confirmation, those connections remained anecdotal. The absence of records created a perfect bureaucratic defense. If there was no proof of exposure, then illness could be attributed to anything else: aging, lifestyle, genetics, stress. Each claim was evaluated in isolation. Patterns were ignored because acknowledging them would require acknowledging the program itself. The acknowledgement did not come until decades later, and even then it came reluctantly. When the Department of Defense finally admitted the existence of Project Shad in the early 2000s, many veterans expected resolution. Instead, they found another wall. Recognition did not automatically translate into accountability. Acknowledging that tests occurred was not the same as admitting harm. Admitting harm would have required opening records, reassessing claims, and confronting the consequences of decades of denial. So the silence evolved rather than ended. Veterans were told that some information could not be located, that some exposures could not be confirmed, that science could not establish definitive links. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together they preserved the same outcome: delay, denial, and attrition. Many veterans died before answers arrived. This chapter of the story is not about a single decision or a single cover-up. It's about what happens when secrecy outlives necessity and when institutions choose to forget rather than confront. The damage done by Project 112 did not end when the last test concluded. It continued quietly, year after year, in medical offices, VA claims files, and families who never understood why a once healthy service member never quite recovered. Silence was not a side effect of the program. It was the final phase. The silence surrounding Project 112 and Project SHAD did not break because the system suddenly developed a conscience. It broke because too many veterans refused to stop asking the same question. What changed in the 1990s was not the evidence, but the pressure. As Cold War secrecy slowly eroded, veterans began to connect dots that had once seemed isolated. Sailors who had served on different ships in different oceans during different years were reporting eerily similar health problems. When they compared service histories, certain ship names kept appearing. Certain test dates overlapped. Certain code names repeated themselves. What had once looked like a coincidence began to look like a pattern. The first cracks came from persistence rather than revelation. Veterans filed Freedom of Information Act requests. Most were denied, some returned heavily redacted, but occasionally a fragment slipped through: a test name, a location, a memo that referenced aerosol releases or vulnerability assessments. Each fragment alone meant little. Together they formed a trail that was increasingly hard to ignore. Journalists picked up the scent. Investigative reporting in the late 1990s and early 2000s began to ask uncomfortable questions about Cold War testing programs that did not fit the familiar nuclear narrative. Articles referenced secret shipboard trials. Veterans were quoted as describing exposures they had never been warned about. The tone shifted from speculation to accusation. For the first time, the Department of Defense faced public scrutiny over a program that had assumed would remain buried indefinitely. Legal action followed. Veterans filed lawsuits alleging negligence, lack of informed consent, and long-term harm. Most faced steep odds. Sovereign immunity protected the government from many claims. Statutes of limitations had long expired. Proving causation decades after exposure was a near impossible task. Even so, the lawsuits forced disclosure during discovery. Documents that had never been intended for public view were suddenly relevant. Not all exposure came through whistleblowers or lawsuits. Some of it came by accident. As records were digitized and archives reorganized, test documentation surfaced in unexpected places. A ship's log referencing unusual operations. A medical memo discussing unexplained symptoms during a deployment. A planning document acknowledging exposure risks that had never been communicated to participants. Each accidental disclosure chipped away at the official narrative that nothing significant had occurred. Congress could not ignore it forever. Hearings were held, veterans testified. Many did so without anger, simply asking for acknowledgement and medical support. Others were more direct, accusing the government of betrayal. Members of Congress expressed surprise, some genuine, sometimes performative, that such a program had existed without oversight. The Department of Defense responded with carefully worded statements, acknowledging the tests while emphasizing defensive intent and limited exposure. The phrase "no evidence of long-term harm" became a refrain. That phrase did not sit well with veterans who were already living with the consequences, nor did it align with emerging medical research that suggested links between exposure to certain agents and chronic illnesses. But the burden of proof remained inverted. Veterans were expected to prove harm rather than the government being required to disprove it. Gradually, acknowledgement expanded. The Department of Defense released lists of tests and participating units. Ship names were added, removed, and sometimes added back again as records were reviewed. Veterans who had been told for years that their service was unrelated suddenly discovered their ship was on a newly updated list. For many, the validation came too late to undo years of denial. Even then, the admission stopped short of accountability. No senior officials were disciplined. No formal apologies were issued. The narrative framed Project SHAD as a product of its time, an unfortunate but understandable outcome of Cold War fears. Responsibility was diffused across decades, offices, and retired personnel. The institution acknowledged the program without accepting blame for its consequences. Still, the wall had cracked. Veterans had forced the government to say the words out loud. Project Shad existed. Service members were exposed. Records had been incomplete. That acknowledgement, however limited, changed everything. It proved the missing second element in VA's claims, the in-service event. It allowed some veterans to reopen cases that had been denied for years. But it also revealed something else. If the truth only emerged because veterans refused to let go, and because documents slipped through cracks, then how many other programs were still hidden? How many exposures remained undocumented? How many illnesses were still being treated as unrelated accidents rather than the predictable outcome of policy? This chapter marks the moment when secrecy begins to fail. Not because the system chose transparency, but because too many people were affected to be ignored any longer. The war no longer knew they fought was finally acknowledged. The cost of that delay would come into focus next, measured not in memos or hearings, but in bodies. When the Department of Defense finally acknowledged Project 112 and Project Shad, it did so the way large institutions often do, carefully, incrementally, and without admitting fault. The admission came in stages. First, confirmation that the programs existed, then acknowledgement that service members had participated. Later still, partial disclosure of test names, dates, and participating units. Each step was presented as transparency. None of them came close to full accountability. The official language mattered. Statements emphasized that the tests were defensive in nature, conducted during a period of heightened Cold War threat. Exposure was described as limited and controlled, and within acceptable parameters for the time. Harm was framed as unproven or anecdotal. Responsibility was diffused across decades of policy, as if time itself diluted obligation. What never appeared in those statements was an apology. Admitting wrongdoing would have opened doors the government had no interest in opening. Legal liability, broad VA presumptions, re-examination of decades of denied claims, questions about ethics, consent, and command responsibility. So the acknowledgement stopped at existence and participation, carefully avoiding causation. The Department of Veterans Affairs followed suit. Policy changes were announced allowing certain Shad veterans to file claims based on participation alone. This sounded like progress, and for some veterans it was. But the reality was narrower than it appeared. Participation did not equal exposure. Exposure did not equal harm, and harm still had to be proven on a case-by-case basis. The burden remained on the veteran. Lists of recognized tests became gatekeepers. If a veteran ship or unit appeared on the list, claims could move forward. If not, the door remained closed. The problem was that the lists were incomplete, revised repeatedly, and often contradictory. Veterans found themselves trapped in a bureaucratic limbo, acknowledged by one document, denied by another. Even when benefits were granted, they came without admission of responsibility. Compensation was framed as assistance, not restitution. The distinction was deliberate. Assistance implies goodwill. Restitution implies wrongdoing. One preserves institutional reputation, the other does not. Internally, the government treated Project Shad as a historical artifact rather than an ongoing obligation. There was no comprehensive effort to locate all affected veterans. No systematic outreach to families of those who had already died. No centralized medical monitoring program to track long-term outcomes. The responsibility to come forward remained with the individual, often decades after the fact. From a policy standpoint, this approach made sense. Broad presumptive coverage would have been expensive and politically risky. From a moral standpoint, it reinforced the same imbalance that had existed from the beginning. The institution that created the risk still controlled the terms under which that risk would be acknowledged. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the government's response was what it did not revisit. There was no serious reevaluation of how Project 112 had been authorized, no inquiry into whether ethical standards had been violated, no examination of how informed consent had been bypassed. The narrative focused forward, on benefits processing and document release, rather than backward on decisions made and lessons ignored. This allowed the program to be framed as an unfortunate byproduct of its era rather than a cautionary example of institutional failure. For veterans, the admission without accountability created a hollow victory. Being told, yes, this happened, after years of denial mattered, but it did not restore health, it did not replace lost time, and it did not answer the question that many veterans cared about the most. Why were we never told? The government's position was clear. Project Shad was acknowledged, the past was closed, the system had moved on. For those still living with the consequences, moving on was not an option. Because acknowledgement without accountability does not resolve a wrong, it only documents it. By the time Project 112 and Project Shad were officially acknowledged, the damage was already written into medical charts, obituaries, and family histories. What made the health fallout so difficult to confront was not just the range of illnesses, but the delay. Chemical and biological exposure rarely produces a single, unmistakable signature. It shows up instead as clusters of conditions that seem unrelated until they are viewed together, over time, across populations. For Shad veterans, those clusters emerged slowly, and were ignored just as slowly. Respiratory problems were among the most common: chronic bronchitis, asthma that appeared in adulthood, persistent coughing, and shortness of breath without a clear cause. Neurological symptoms followed similar patterns: headaches, tremors, memory loss, balance issues, peripheral neuropathy. Some veterans reported cognitive decline decades before it would normally be expected. Autoimmune disorders appeared with unsettling frequency, conditions in which the body turns on itself, attacking nerves, joints, or organs without an obvious trigger. These are notoriously difficult to link to specific exposures, which made them easy to dismiss in individual cases and impossible to ignore in aggregate. Cancer loomed over everything. Veterans reported rare cancers, early onset cancers, and multiple primary cancers in the same individual. Again, no single case proved causation, but the statistical noise became harder to explain away as more veterans came forward. The longer the government delayed acknowledgement, the harder it became to establish clear timelines linking exposure to diagnosis. The delay was not neutral, it had consequences. Without acknowledgement of exposure, physicians treated symptoms in isolation. A cough was just a cough, fatigue was stress, memory issues were aging. Veterans were prescribed medications without anyone asking whether a common source might be responsible. Opportunities for early intervention were lost. Patterns that could have informed treatment were missed. Families paid the price as well. Spouses became caregivers without understanding why their partner's health was failing. Children grew up watching unexplained decline. In some cases, veterans died before the existence of Project Shad was ever publicly admitted. Their families never received answers, only paperwork stating that no service connection could be established. Denial compounded the harm. Even after acknowledgement, veterans faced a system that moved slowly and cautiously. Claims took years, appeals dragged on. Some veterans won benefits only after exhausting their health, their savings, and their patience. Others gave up. A system designed to require proof worked exactly as intended, filtering out all but the most persistent. The psychological toll was as real as the physical one. Being told repeatedly that nothing happened, that exposure could not be confirmed, that symptoms were unrelated, created a second injury. Veterans began to doubt their own experiences. Some stopped seeking care altogether. Others withdrew from a process that felt designed to wear them down. Comparisons to Agent Orange and burn pits were inevitable. In each case, the pattern was the same. Exposure first, denial second, acknowledgement decades later, after enough evidence accumulated and enough veterans had already suffered. Project Shad fit neatly into that lineage, not as an anomaly, but as a preview. The cost of denial is measured in more than money. It's measured in years of untreated illnesses, in stress placed on families, in trust eroded between service members and the institutions that sent them into harm's way. It is measured in the knowledge that the harm was not inevitable, but the result of choices. Choices made easier by secrecy and sustained by silence. By the time the government was willing to talk about Project Shad, many veterans no longer needed acknowledgement. They needed care. Others needed closure. Some needed both. What they received instead was a lesson written across decades. When harm is denied long enough, acknowledgement becomes an accounting exercise rather than an act of responsibility. And that cost, like the exposure itself, was borne almost entirely by the people least able to refuse it. Project 112 and Project Shad are no longer secrets. Their names appear in government reports, congressional testimony, and VA policy manuals. On paper, the story is closed. The programs existed, they ended, lessons were learned. The problem is that those lessons are rarely stated out loud. At its core, Project 112 was not a failure of science or technology. It was a failure of governance. The chemical and biological threat was real. The need to prepare for it was real. What failed was the belief that preparation required deception, silence, and the quiet use of human beings as test instruments without their knowledge. That belief did not emerge in a vacuum. It was the product of Cold War power structures that prioritized institutional survival over individual rights. Secrecy was treated as a moral good. Obedience was assumed. Oversight was seen as a liability rather than a safeguard. In that environment, ethical boundaries were not crossed dramatically. They were eroded gradually until they no longer functioned at all. Project Shad shows how easily that erosion becomes normalized. Once service members are viewed as assets rather than people, exposure becomes a variable instead of a violation. Once secrecy is elevated above accountability, harm can be reclassified as acceptable risk. And once those assumptions are embedded in policy, reversing them becomes nearly impossible without external pressure. The most troubling aspect of Project 112 is not that it happened, but how long it remained unchallenged. It survived challenges in administration, shifts in public opinion, and even the end of the Cold War itself. It outlived the threats that supposedly justified it. What finally exposed it was not institutional review, but the persistence of the people it harmed. That pattern should feel uncomfortably familiar. Agent Orange, Atomic Veterans, burn pits, each followed the same trajectory: exposure justified by necessity, denial sustained by bureaucracy, admission delayed until the cost of denial exceeded the cost of acknowledgement. Project 112 sits squarely in that lineage, not as an outlier, but as a template. The legacy of Project Shad is therefore not confined to history. It raises questions that remain unresolved. How much secrecy is truly necessary? Who gets to decide what risks are acceptable and for whom? What mechanisms exist to prevent readiness from becoming rationalization? And most importantly, what happens when those mechanisms fail? For the veterans involved, legacy is personal. It is measured in health struggles, in years spent navigating a system that did not want to remember them, and in the knowledge that their service included a war they were never told they were fighting. Recognition came late. Accountability never really came at all. For institutions, the lesson is harder to accept. Transparency can be retroactive, ethics cannot be optional, and secrecy, once justified, has a way of perpetuating itself long after the original purpose is gone. Project 112 demonstrates that the greatest danger of secret programs is not what they accomplish, but what they make acceptable. The war no one knew they fought did not end when the last test concluded. It ended only after the veterans forced it into the open, and even then only partially. What remains is a record of decisions made in quiet rooms, consequences borne by people with no say in them, and a warning written clearly enough for anyone willing to read it. Power without accountability does not disappear when a program ends. It waits for the next justification. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.